Keynote speaker. That's Professor Carl May, Professor in Healthcare Innovation from Southampton University. He will introduce himself further, but one good thing is that he is the godfather, together with Tracy Finch, of the Normalisation Process Theory. And that theory is really conquering the Netherlands, so that's a specific reason why we are very happy that you are here. The floor is yours. You have around 35-40 minutes. And I say I give you the 5, and then it's over.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Carl May. I'm a sociologist who's making a weird echoing noise. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. Oh yes, we're streaming, aren't we? We're streaming live. I've something to say to people who are watching this on the web. Why aren't you here? Why aren't you here? You've missed a fantastic day. And now it's just the dregs now, it's just me. So I'm going to talk to you about normalisation process theory. It's a theory. It's it's become a life's work for me, and in a way that I never expected. It started off with somebody telling me that there was no place for sociological theory in implementation research, and I got a little angry about that, as you might imagine, because I'm a sociologist. And in a fit of pique, I went away and started to write a theory. And here we are more than 10 years later, and we've got close to 200 reported studies and work around the world probably worth about $200 million US, which I have to say, I never expected to be able to say anything like that. So, my second slide when I'm talking about NPT usually has a very large picture of Tracy Finch, but she doesn't like that picture, and I know she doesn't like that picture, and I'm not going to make her look at it now, but Tracy is here, and so you can see her in real life. I must acknowledge my sponsors, the Economic and Social Research Council, who very generously funded work leading to the presentation I'm giving today. All of this begins with a problem that I encountered as somebody who was doing evaluation work around new technology implementation, which was that it was very, very difficult. It was clearly very difficult for organisations to actually, they could do lots of diffusion, they could do lots of adoption. So people were adopting and diffusing as if there was no tomorrow, but the real problem was that actually the things that they were adopting and diffusing weren't becoming integrated or incorporated in everyday practice. I had a fantastic moment with an emergency department doctor when we were talking about telemedicine systems. And he said, you can tell it doesn't work. You can tell telemedicine doesn't work. Because if it worked, it would be called medicine. And I sort of thought about that, and I thought, yes, this is exactly the problem. It's the fact that these are things that aren't disappearing into everyday life. They're constantly presented as innovations, new things that are exciting and different. They're never presented as routinely available tools that people would just like use without having to have a degree in electronics or something like that. And so I began to look at, empirically, the factors that promoted or inhibited the routine incorporation of what we've called complex interventions. We should really just call them interventions, because there's no such thing as a simple intervention, as most of you will know. Nothing is ever simple in a healthcare system. new technologies, new ways of working, new professional roles, organisational innovations, different ways of making decisions about treatment. We began to look at that, and we began to get quite excited because we could begin to think about the different mechanisms that are involved. So in this talk, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about the way that we understand interventions and implementation, and that's really some definitions. I'm going to very briefly describe, excuse me, the range of, some features of the range of ways of understanding implementation processes. And then I'm going to talk about the work that Tracy and I and a fairly large group of collaborators have developed Normalisation Process Theory. So we're going to start with a simple definition of implementation, and it astonishes me how few studies in implementation science actually ever define what they're actually about. So the definition that we have used now for more than 10 years is that implementation is a deliberately initiated attempt to introduce new or modify existing patterns of collective action in healthcare. So this is all about people working together to achieve goals, or sometimes not working together to achieve goals, and sometimes very definitely not achieving goals. So this is how we define implementation. And it's important that we say it's deliberately initiated, because that saves us from having to worry about things where that arrive by accident, or that are gradually diffused through a system because people just start doing it. So there was a time, incidentally, when PowerPoint wasn't normal. Okay? There may be people in this room who, like me, can remember a time when PowerPoint wasn't a normal part of a conference presentation. And that, in fact, somebody like me would use the medium of speech to deal with an issue. But now we have technologies that have changed the role of the speaker. So now I no longer address you as an authority. Instead, I mediate between the slide and the audience. I am a mere messenger, an intermediary. That wasn't how it was. Once upon a time, that didn't happen. So PowerPoint diffused through the higher education system, but then people started to implement PowerPoint. Suddenly they started to install screens like this. They started to have projectors that would drop down from the ceiling. And they introduced storage devices that enabled students to go back and look again and again at a set of uninformative PowerPoint slides rather than go and read a textbook. So we have this extraordinary kind of change in the way that meetings like this happen, where implementing a simple technological device has changed the relationships between us, the role of the speaker, and incidentally, the role of the audience. Because your job now is to admire my artistic and typographical skill, as well as to absorb the important lessons that Jill Sans 24 point can deliver you. So, here we are. Deliberate initiation means that an intervention is institutionally sanctioned, formally defined, consciously planned, so it's not an accident. And lots of things do get implemented by accident. I mean, you may have noticed that quite recently, the United Kingdom detached itself from the continent of which it's part and is slowly drifting away into the Atlantic. Trust me, nobody intended that to happen. Even the people who were trying to get people to vote for it did not believe it was a likely outcome of what they were doing. And so they made no plans for what would happen if the vote went their way. Quite extraordinary. So I am a European for a few more months, and after that, I shall just have to be a citizen of the Republic of Science. So there's a thing about implementation. People look at it. The processes by which those things that I've described often happen are often very, very unclear. They're often mystified or obfuscated by language. I love this. Then a miracle occurs. And there's an important thing there about how many implementation projects are run. Lots of science about why it should be done, and lots of interesting thoughts about what will happen when it's done, and not a lot of information about what's going to happen there. So, interventions themselves, as I said, are never simple. They're always complex, and they contain many moving parts. And this has helped me, because I began to think about normalisation processes, the routine embedding of practices in everyday life. I began to think about them, I began to think about them as things that were driven by mechanisms that didn't happen. There was no flow. There were actually things that were being done, action that was being taken to make things happen. And we began to focus on a real kind of sense of implementation is about what people do, it's about the actions that they take, it's about the environments in which they act and work together or contest interventions or whatever they do. And we left behind work that focused on how people's attitudes are converted into intentions and then into behaviours. There are already many theories that helped us understand those. So we focused, Tracy and I and others, as we developed NPT, on what we thought was an implementation-shaped hole in implementation science theory. So we knew that there was lots of work about how individuals behaved and how they worked together. About how they enacted their intentions. But much less about collective action, about how people interact together relationally and structurally to make things happen. And we arrive here at the theory zoo, which Bianca introduced us to earlier on, with enormous numbers of theories and frameworks of models, many of which, it has to be said, look suspiciously similar to each other. I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying they all look pretty much alike. Whereas these zebras demonstrate a remarkable degree of genetic diversity, far more than their external appearance would suggest. So we must love the zebras and protect them from the lions or from that crocodile which is just there. You know, the zebras are going to have a shock. So, there are all of these models, and they work in very particular ways. They direct attention. And that's what theories are supposed to do. They're supposed to direct your attention. Somewhere in here, and it's not where I hoped it was, I've got a cartoon from the New Yorker that talks about what happens when we look at something. So we see these two kinds of theories were very common. Theories that were about the attributes of organisations and environments, and they were heavily influenced by a long-standing tradition of sociological research about diffusion processes that actually comes out of work on in rural sociology about how different kinds of corn seed moved through the market in Kansas in the 1940s. Sounds a little bit, but actually it's really, really good work, and it still bears looking at. And then I've already talked about the role of individualism. So we do have theoretical models that deal similarly with similar problems. So I have two here. One's a sociological model. Any sociologists in the room? Yeah, good. So Peter Hedstrom, who is a great sociologist from Sweden, was professor at Oxford for a number of years. And he has pioneered a model of theory that looks at how desires and beliefs and opportunities are drawn together by individuals to create social action. And Susan Mickey, quite independently, has come up with a very similar looking model, which she calls the COM-B model, because it's capability, opportunity, motivation and behaviour, that does some of the same things. Now, these models are actually a bit more different than they look. They're very powerful tools to think about individual behaviour. But from where I'm sitting, the problem isn't necessarily individual behaviour. The problem is interactions, relations between people, and structures that they're located in, and how they work with those and move forward. So this is Laura Damschroeder's fabulous consolidated framework for implementation research. Again, a very powerful structure for thinking about where implementation work happens and what it looks like. It was published in the same month as Tracy and my paper on Normalisation Process Theory, and again, it includes some things that matter to us as well as to Laura. So there's some stuff here about process that's very important, and recently Tracy and I have been doing some work about what Laura calls the inner context, but we don't quite develop in that way. So why would we build new theory? There was lots of theory. There's already lots of theory. But there wasn't a theoretical framework back in the mid-2000s that we felt would explain this tremendous problem of incorporation and integration. You know, it was very difficult, and Tracy Finch did a wonderful ethnographic paper in the BMJ about how it was incredibly hard for consultant clinicians to work a telemedicine system into an outpatient's clinic, because it involved those consultants doing something that they would never normally do. It involved them carefully timetabling their work and sticking to it, which is an insurmountable obstacle for some of those medics. And so we had other theories. I'm not going to go through them now, but the most important one from the sociological perspective is Bruno Latour and Michel Caron's work about actor networks and the relationships between people and things, and how actors and objects create these very interesting networks that flow and have relationships, and it all gets a bit postmodern for me at that point, but the scholarship that underpins it is absolutely extraordinary. But here's the thing. What do we ask of a theory? What should we ask of a theory? We should ask that it provides a systematic and rational explanation for a set of phenomena, and that it does so in a generic way. So a theory of implementation in healthcare should also be a theory of implementation in agriculture. And I can afford to say that now that somebody's used normalisation process theory to investigate the regulation of organic seed production in Mexico, a topic with which I think we're all excited. But theories are always provisional, they're always incomplete, and they must be falsifiable. You know, you can never prove a theory right, but you can always prove it wrong. Okay? And finally, in the end, all theories collapse under the weight of their own anomalies, which is what's happening at the moment to the theory of planned behaviour. It's been so overextended and overused and translated into settings that it was never intended to deal with. And the bulk of the weight of negative results is beginning to carry it down. There's a great paper by Volko Snijhotter, who's just, I think, finished being president of the European Health Psychology Association, that sort of deals with some of that stuff. So now the meat, what is normalisation process theory? Okay, well, it's a bundle of journal articles, some of which have been typeset more attractively than others. But we're interested in understanding implementation as something that is more about just getting something done. It's about a very complex set of activities and relationships, where the thing that we're implementing is never just a thing in itself. It's a huge set of relationships, of meanings, of practices that sometimes go on a fair distance from the actual thing that we're looking at, the actual focus of our attention, and that have wider implications that change the world. So my example of PowerPoint tells us something about this. We can implement PowerPoint. So we have some software, a screen, another screen, a projector and a little server, and here is PowerPoint. But actually, PowerPoint changes things, and what's being implemented when you bring PowerPoint into play is not a picture on a wall. It's a way of being, and it's a way of acting, and it's a way of behaving. There's a way of falling over, in which everything is different and everything changes. So we've looked at empirically at mechanisms that drive those changes more widely. We have a view of context in which the context of an implementation process is not just like a place. It's not a place. It's a set of resources that people draw on to make something possible. It's a set of resources that give people potential to act. And by that I don't just mean material resources like money and kit. I mean resources like rules, like norms and values and ideas about what the world should look like. So one of the reasons that the world didn't end when PowerPoint was invented was people still had a set of norms and rules about how they would behave in a lecture theatre. And those seem to have been transferred unproblematically to everybody except the speaker. So the work that we've done, we've built our theory using about 100 empirical studies, not all of which are NPT studies, so that everything in the theory is empirically grounded. There is no philosophical speculation in normalisation process theory. For those of you who have ever read Glaser and Strauss, this is an old-fashioned, formal, grounded theory. I'd like to describe it in more exciting and postmodern terms, but actually I can't. That's what it is. So we've got 3 layers of core concepts: relationship between people and things. So what are the properties of those relationships? Is PowerPoint interactionally workable? Well, by goodness, it is. It really is. Does it inspire confidence? Well, you're all taking photographs. Does it require a set of skills? Well, yes, actually it does. And you will see that I'm having to work much harder than I would have to if I had a really good, high-quality set of animated, cool overheads. And you can see I still call them overheads, which demonstrates, it demonstrates just how antediluvian I am. The way in which most people see NPT is these four mechanisms. This is the core of the theory, and it's all about how people work together. They do work that makes an intervention and its environment coherent. They do a lot of sense-making work. They do work about participation. They make enrolment processes. They draw people in. People work hard to make other people work. And they work hard to make that work legitimate. So one reason why some telemedicine services fail is that while psychiatrists think that telemedicine is their job, psychiatric nurses often don't. They don't regard it as a legitimate part of nursing work. And then more recently, we've started to situate our work on coherence and participation and collective action and monitoring in a kind of wider structure where we bring those norms and roles and the potential, the cognitive resources that people bring to sort of start thinking about how those inform contribution. And we call that extended NPT. NPT tells us quite a lot. And here's that cartoon I told you about, and it's quite telling. So here's two guys. Can everybody at the back read the caption? No, some of you can't. So these two guys are looking at that thing, and one of them is saying, it's not high definition anything. It's a window. And I just thought there was a wonderful existential truth in this. A theory is a window. It frames things. It directs our attention to some things and not others. And as it does so, the real risk that a theory brings is a kind of tunnel vision in which only that theory matters and only what that theory demonstrates matters. And the world is a more complicated and interesting place than that sort of view will allow. But on the other hand, there are some things that really do matter. And NPT, as I've said, is all about the work. It's about the work that people do. And that work... Oh, my ear's falling off. That's not a good thing, is it? Oh, no, my other ear's falling off. Oh, well. Let's see if I could get to the end without everything falling off. So we do all of this work. We make all of this work happen. As we use PowerPoint, we make all of this stuff happen. We make the thing coherent. We bring it all together. We have people participate. It's actually very difficult to have people participate in a PowerPoint presentation. You have to work quite hard. But actually, you can. I'm going to very briefly just point to three really interesting contexts in which NPT has been used and where people have applied the theory as I've described it. So I'm going to start off with the WISE trial, which looked at self-management of complex intervention, comorbid conditions in Britain. Fantastic piece of work that looked as though it was going to change the face of care and self-management for people with diabetes and those kinds of illnesses. And yet somehow it failed. And it failed... a very rigorous analysis using normalisation process theory tells us, because it could never get purchase on, it could never become truly integrated and workable in the healthcare system. it lost its contextual integration. The nurses who were supposed to implement it didn't think it was a legitimate part of their work. There was no good way for clinicians to pick up what they were discovering. It failed because it lost its capacity to get people to participate. And when they did, they couldn't take effective action. Whereas the MOVE trial, which is my favourite trial of all time, for reasons that I'm about to make clear, I know some of the investigators. This is a trial of surveillance and screening for domestic violence in the state of Victoria in Australia. And I had met a couple of the investigators very briefly in 2008, and last year one of them sent me an email that just said NPT validated. And they had picked up that work and they carried it forward. And they had shown how if you use NPT not just as an evaluation tool, but to inform the design of your intervention, and focus on things like participation and action, and also the kind of monitoring components that people are involved in, they showed how that would lead not just to a really successful outcome in clinical terms, but in fact, when the trial ended, the nurses who were doing the screening just carried on doing it. They had normalised it into their practice. It had become routinely embedded, and they're still doing it today. And, I know I'm a sociologist, so I don't get to do much intervention design, but I was so proud that they used it and that they made it work in that way. I thought that was a really righteous piece of work. If you're watching, Angela, on the web, hi. I don't know whether anybody actually anywhere is watching on the web, or whether it's just like a joke. But the prospect that that's possible is completely normalised in my world. It's routinely embedded in big conferences now. We don't think about it. It's a possibility. And so TRACS is a trial where I can't really tell you what the outcome is in NPT terms. But what the investigators discovered as they worked with it was that the whole business of implementing a very complex intervention with multiple participants and layers of participation and many different kinds of action. This is a stroke rehabilitation study. They revealed very, very powerful evidence of the role that context plays in shaping action. And Tracy and I have incorporated some of that evidence in our most recent NPT paper, which it would be great if I could advertise in some way now, but I just forgot to put it in. This is just to close the sort of empirical stuff. My PhD student, Mark Johnson, and I did a review of professional behaviour change interventions, or a review of reviews, sorry. And we coded them using NPT, and we began to show that the most successful behaviour change interventions focused on this end. They focused actually on collective action and monitoring, except for these ones up here, which are patient-mediated interventions, which are where the power of getting change is shifted from the system to the patient, and the patient makes a demand of the clinician. So this, again, was very important to me in thinking about the role of context. We call this the red shift, after the way that Edwin Hubble determined the speed of galaxies moving away from the centre of the universe. But we did it because it was like red. And so finally, just one last slide. We often talk about implementation processes, and we talk about the way in which theories and models make them complicated. But the life cycle of a complex intervention is actually quite a simple one. And here it is. At some point, somebody decides that the way that people are working isn't right and needs to be changed. And then they invest a huge amount of work and effort in making it disappear, or not making it disappear. Sometimes they fail. Resources are then mobilised to fill that gap. Collective action takes place, and I've been talking about collective action. So that collective action gets negotiated out of the implementation study into the world. It becomes absorbed into practice. And that's always a set of negotiations. It's never easy. The rules of practice get changed. Relationships get changed. And then there's a period where an intervention seems workable and well integrated. And then suddenly people say, we don't want to use PowerPoint anymore. We're going to use, I can't remember the name of it. What's the one where you look at it and you get motion sickness. Yeah. Prezi, It's like watching Star Wars at an IMAX cinema. So a way has to be found of overcoming those technical problems. People wanted to use Prezi because it looked so much cooler. And nobody had anticipated that you could make an entire audience of first-year undergraduates feel really unwell, which, from where I'm sitting as a lecturer, added benefit. So here are the papers that we've used. They're all pretty much open access. This, sadly, isn't open access anymore, unless you go to my ResearchGate site, where, until I'm prosecuted, it sits perfectly and happily. You can just download it for free. So that's